as a supplement to the classes I'm teaching in the solo form, I want to show a little bit about the marrow washing exercises. I've mentioned many times when teaching these exercises that they can be done in as sophisticated or as simple a way as you want, and they have virtue. I mean, they have some virtues in any case. But so first, let me just go through the simple outlines of them. One of the most, let's say, subtle ones is the spinal wave, which is done like this. Okay, now this has some features that have to be carefully attended to. Notice for one thing, notice my ankles. They're opening and closing. In other words, I'm not doing this. Notice now there's no action in the ankles, and some people tend to just sort of try to do this sort of with their spine. The whole thing is accomplished with the legs in the sense that it controls the pelvis, and the action it makes on the pelvis is very similar to the action you might make on the handle of a whip. You're doing something like this. So when you do this, you don't just go like this, but first you actually reverse this. You sort of tuck under with the butt of the whip, and then you crack it like this. So this is analogous to this initial action. So here we're tucking under, and then the rest of the body is like the body of the whip, and then it's a bunch of flexible joints, you might say, which finally end in the movement of the head. So as opposed to moving the body stiffly up and down like this, the pelvis works first, then it sort of cracks, and finally the head is like the final action of this. So this is the basic action you want. Now, like all Qigong practices, the principle is you start off with big motions so that you can make sure to include all the muscles. If you were to start like this, you might just be very stagnant in certain areas of the muscles. The trick is to engage all the muscles of the body when you move, but to make those muscles act in a very sequential way that's very controlled. And so the best way to get a handle on that sequence and that control is to do them in a very big form first. The classic says, first make big movements, then make smaller movements, and that way the movements become what they call fine and delicate. So this kind of basic principle of Qigong, and this particular spinal wave action is a good example of that. This can finally become more and more subtle, until finally it becomes something that sort of spontaneously happens every time you take a breath. But this, in other words, so just the act of breathing should make this kind of change, this wave-like action occur in the body, but it can be so subtle that you don't see it. If you practice this, and then you practice sitting down in meditation, you may discover that as you're in your meditation, you find the whole spine mimicking this action in an extremely subtle way. Now, when you are standing on your feet, you want to make sure that this action starts with this release of the pelvis. So in other words, and you don't want to do this with a forceful action of the pelvis this way. The pelvis has some action in this motion, but it's gradually replaced by something so subtle that it's more like the legs just release and the pelvis drops into it. So now this, as I say, can become extremely subtle, and in a certain sense, when you're doing Tai Chi, every time you make a motion, every time you put weight on a leg, you release the leg in such a way that you always feel this sort of wave-like action potentially happening, and happening in a very small way. So this is usually done, with the legs fairly wide apart, but it can be done with any width. So again, this is the spinal wave. Now, what makes this subtle is, as I say, the idea that the very first thing that happens is this release of the pelvis. And then the further action of the pelvis is created really by a flexing of the ankles. As you release the pelvis, the ankles flex, the knees come forward, and then as it reaches its limit here and sort of tips over, you bring the knees back, and this creates this whip-like action in the body. Okay. Now, the point of these, there are these 3 marrow washing exercises. There are more than that. There's, you can find catalogs of lots and lots of so-called marrow washing exercises. But these 3 are really classic and really kind of basic. And what I want to show you today is how they sort of aid each other in terms of subtlety. Again, this is not particularly subtle if you just see the sort of bare external action of it. Now we're going to take a look at another exercise, which, let's do the simplest version of it first, where we put most of our weight on the forward leg. If you want to think of it as a classic 70-30 stance, whereas this is more of a horse stance, you weight in the middle. Now you're going to, you can think of it like this. The feet are parallel here, and then they sort of turn. They're still parallel, but now most of the weight is on the forward leg. Now you turn the waist back and forth. Notice in this motion, there was no turn of the waist. There was no turn of the waist, and here the waist is actually turning this way. But the point I want to make is that as we turn the waist, we want always to feel this constant release of the tailbone, so that we have this action which is called sung, releasing like this. So in everything that we do, we want to never get into just kind of going back and forth so that this is held in a stiff way, but we want to constantly, even as the waist turns, constantly release, so that we're also always, in a way, doing this body wave at the same time. But then we turn the waist by opening and closing the quad. When we open and close the quad, this causes action. Technically, all we're doing is, when we open the quad, we're pushing the foot one way and the hips the other way. But because the foot is reasonably rooted to the floor and doesn't slip and slide, instead, this action is reflected in a motion of the waist completely. Now, this is what's called rooted in the feet, transmitted by the legs and directed by the waist. This action of turning this way and that is the direction in terms of this idea of directing the force. So we go back and forth, and now we're going to take a look at what happens to the arms. Let's make it really simple by sort of isolating we'll immobilize the left arm, and just think of the right arm, which is cross-substantial to this left leg. If we're controlling the body completely with the action of the left leg, and by opening and closing the quad, then this arm swings back and forth in that way. Now, obviously, by swinging it back and forth, we can reach the point where it swings all the way over. Now, obviously, it has to be swinging at a certain, force for that to happen without any aid on our part. We could be stiff about it. I could just go. So in this case, I'm just moving the arm mechanically to reflect the action of the waist. But what we want is for the waist to move strongly enough that we actually get the arm to swing up and over. So we're making it move in this circle. Now, the sort of external development of this is to make every possible variation of it. In other words, we swing the arm this way, then we swing it by turning the waist the other way. Then we think, okay, we can also swing the arm on the same side using the same turn of the waist, and that can go back and forth. And finally, we can swing them both at the same time. Now, interestingly enough, I found this is the only exercise I will ever teach you that will impress anyone. I was once teaching in a certain health spa, not exactly a health spa, it was connected with the University of California hospital. And no matter what I did, no matter how sophisticated the Tai Chi was, the people doing the other exercises, the bicycles and the stuff, they never paid any attention. But when we did this exercise, they said, oh wow, that's really something. So this is what happened. So I'll explain the external details in a little more detail. The arms always are the same here, and they come around and the the same at the bottom. So don't do this. This is not it. But instead, they swing this way. And if they reverse, they have the same quality. So, again, I don't want to get too much into this external thing because you could just watch this and finally get it yourself because you can repeat it. But this is, so the arms are just swinging back and forth as they might do when you're walking. But as you go farther and faster, then finally, they swing all the way around. And they can go that way, or they can go the other way. And this is a matter of just more or less letting your arm be completely loose and limp and feeling the transmission of the wave coming from the turn of the waist into the arm. Now, but the subtle quality here is in the manner of a whip. Watch the development here. If I go at a certain speed like this, the waist makes a large motion and the arm makes a large motion with it. But as I go faster, I don't want to make the same degree of motion with the waist. In other words, the amount of angular displacement in the waist is reduced the faster I go. So in other words, if I'm, just to mimic this with a hand, if I'm doing this, if I go faster, I don't want to do this. But as it goes faster, it also becomes smaller. So the faster it goes, the more its cycle is confined, its wavelength reduces. And then as it goes slower, the wavelength becomes bigger. So notice at a certain point, it gets way ahead of the action of the arm. Instead of seeming to connect to it directly, it more like sort of gives it a little kick, as though you're sort of kicking something along. So, and that little kick is created by a reversal of the qua. In other words, the qua closes and opens. Again, this action is not as big as when we're going slower. And the faster we go, the faster, the smaller that action becomes. So you should practice this. You can feel this element of the waist getting ahead of the action of the arm, so it sends out this signal, and the arm reflects this pulse, but in a way that is not rigidly timed with that. Now, the other exercise, the final exercise, is probably the most sophisticated and the most interesting, usually called the constant bear. A little bit hard to understand what that means. It's sort of like being constantly like a bear is the way it is. And the idea is that a bear, I think a bear is characterized by walking sort of this way. So, in other words, as I walk, the waist sort of turns and the arms swing back and forth. So this is the idea that the waist turns, the weight is shifted from leg to leg, and the arms swing naturally in order to accommodate this. But again, now here's how they relate to the other forms. As with the sort of windmill exercise, as we go slowly, the arms swing exactly in coordination with the turn of the waist. But as you go faster, it starts to get ahead of the action of the waist. Now, this is the thing about your somatic condition. You must always have the same degree of relaxation in the body. So if you did this slowly and then you speed it up and you wanted to make it the same, you would have to stiffen the arms to make them keep up with the waist in this way. But instead, the waist starts to get ahead. So that it even reaches the point where it seems to be going exactly in the opposite direction. This kind of action of the waist is kind of, if you move your steps like this, the arms kind of naturally swing back and forth this way. So we're trying for that extremely natural action of the arms. Okay? But again, you'll discover that as you go faster, it becomes a matter of the change of direction at the end. In other words, instead of thinking of it as 1, 2, like this, in other words, of each action being a shift from 100% to the other leg at 100%. Instead, think of it as a bunch of stuff happening on one leg and then something happening on the other leg. In other words, the action is not defined by here to here, but it's defined by from the middle back to the middle. And this means the gua closes and opens. Again, if we do it slowly, that opening and closing of the gua causes the arms to move in a way that's completely connected. But as we go faster, it starts to get out of sequence with the movement. So this is what happens as we practice the constant bear. Now, I sometimes call this the generic Asian exercise because it sort of has any number of versions of it. In other words, you don't have to be that sophisticated in the way that you shift the legs, the weight back and forth. You can just push it and use gravity and just kind of fall into one leg and turn the waist. As you get more sophisticated, you want to think of the body as always being controlled by only one leg at a time, and that leg being the leg that has the most weight on it. So again, this action of back and forth becomes something you do with the left leg, something you do with the right leg, and so forth. So now we want to add an action of the arms so that they don't just swing in a broken fashion back and forth. But we want to say, let's just turn the palm up as it crosses. We do not want to close the bird's nest, so we do not want this action to swing the arm across the body this way. But we want to purposely discipline it. So it stops here, and this causes it to bend at the elbow a little bit. If we add a conscious effort of Chan Tzu Jing, it winds as it turns this way and this way. Now, notice this is a rather stiff rendition because I'm simply turning the waist and coordinating the movements of the arms. I can make it even stiffer, sort of make it look like this. Okay? But what we want is to, now I'm talking about the way these exercises support each other. We want to have the same looseness that we experienced doing this exercise. So we can't allow some sort of stiff execution of these forms. But we want this action, this winding action of the arm, to proceed as a kind of wave. So instead of everything turning at once, first the upper arm turns, then the lower arm, and finally swings up this way. So it first swings the palm over, and then it reaches its limit and swings back. Now again, we can also import some discipline from the body wave in the sense that we don't want to just do this, but we want to release as though we're making sung, and at the same time, now as you notice when we do this, it starts to look looser in the arms. And we also want to examine what happens at this moment of change. It swings up and then opens. But as it opens, it's actually reversing the winding action of the arms. So in other words, this swings up and back. Because in a stiff fashion, if it gets slowly, it swings up to pung. As it goes back, then it becomes ang. Then it becomes pung and ang. But what we want this change to actually occur is right at the moment of change of the qua. So it's like a whip. And you can even feel it creating a kind of karate chop. And so, again though, it has the same quality that it lags behind the action of the waist. The action of the waist is a quick action, and the arm follows behind it. So, swings up and reverses, and you can sort of feel it chop over this way. Now, I'm sort of emphasizing it, don't do that. But instead, just let it be natural. Now, this becomes quite sophisticated because what you have to feel is this reversal being reflected in this reversal of the chances jing of the arm. So you can sort of isolate it to one motion. But then, as that happens, the other hand is also happening. So then, the constant bear becomes quite a bit more sophisticated. As I say, it has the quality of the body wave, you're making sung all the time, and it has the quality of this action, in that the arms are completely reflecting the motion of the waist in a change of substantial and insubstantial, and then you are adding to that the sophistication of the winding changes of Chansa Jing. Just a little technical point about the 3 marrow washing exercises. They all give you an opportunity to exert some control over the knees. The general rule is you want the knee to, as much as possible, be aligned with the toe. There are certain cases where it's pointing in another direction, but you always want a kind of vertical alignment, and you want the knee to resist efforts to destabilize it. For instance, when you're doing the arm swinging exercise, if I face this way, you'll see it here, here. Now notice the knee might exhibit a little back and forth motion, and of course that back and forth motion is because the center is staying stable. If the center is stable, then the hip is going to move back and forth as you do this, and that's going to cause the knee to move a little bit back and forth. So it should move back and forth in a straight alignment, and it should not reflect any kind of wobbling in this way. It'll always show a little vibration because it's being controlled from both directions. The ankle is trying to fight against the action of the qua. If the qua opens and it tends to push the knee out, then the ankle reverses that and tries to hold it in, and vice versa. If you close the qua, pull the knee in, the ankle tries to hold the knee out. So these two forces operating all at the same time tend to produce this little vibration in the knee when it's under your control. And that's even when you're doing the form. You make a motion like this. If it's really been controlled correctly, you will not see any general tendency of the knee to collapse one way or move the other way, but it'll seem like it's sort of uncertain about exactly which way it wants to go. Now, this holds true also in the marrow washing exercise of the wave. Here, I don't know quite how to show this. I guess this is the best aspect. Here, when we're doing the wave, however large or small the horse stance is that you're doing the wave in, you want to try to keep the knees. There's no turn of the waist here, so there's no difficulty about one knee going in and one knee going out, but you want to keep the knees as going in a straight line like this. And you want to keep them as much as possible aligned with the direction of the toe. So in other words, don't just let them collapse. You could still do the form like this, do this exercise. But it's much better to keep practice here. And again, make that adjustment in the knees, not by opening the quads, but by controlling the ankles so that they're completely independent of what the qua is doing. Like so. And then in the constant bear, we have the same thing, which produces a slight kind of time delay. In other words, if I don't have the right control of the knees and I watch my knees, this is what tends to happen. Notice they're just swinging back and forth underneath me. But if it's correct, this one holds in place until this one gets here, so you have this momentary horse stance. Then this closes, this knee collapses, and it opens, comes back, and you have another momentary horse stance. Instead of like this. So this is your chance to exercise the most elementary control over the Chansa Jing of the knees. So I'd like to get some feedback on this, and because this is quite abbreviated, but these are sort of the window into the more subtle aspects of these particular exercises. Thank you.